Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And the flu is long behind me now, so I'm very happy about that. But I do hope you're all keeping yourself lovely and warm and making sure that you keep those winter chills away. So let's get started with part 3 of our story, and it's incredibly exciting because we're about to learn what did actually happen to Mr. Warrington. Chuck is about to reveal this to his friend, and we're going to find out all the secrets. And let's continue with our story. My wife's brows popped up above her eyes quite sharply, furrowing into many enigmatic puzzle lines. Sorry, say that again. The owner of this house was killed on the property. I don't understand. How did this happen? And what do you mean exactly by mysterious?
That's what I mean, Mrs. Turnbull. No one knows precisely what happened to him, although I dare say the family know more than they're actually saying. If you talk to them about the event, they skirt over it as if they're hiding something, he said, replacing his glasses and looking directly from me to my wife. I'm not sure what happened, but they found Mr. Warrington lying from a tree with his head hanging off his neck at a rather odd angle. It almost appeared as if his face had been bludgeoned, stripped off his head, as if it had melted away like candle wax. It wasn't pretty by any manner of means, I'm told. And as I say, it is paradoxically bizarre. One of life's unorthodox mysteries, you could say, but enough to distress the entire family quite significantly, and was probably the sole reason that this place was put on the market. I guess Chuck Warrington decided to sell, and you cannot blame him for that.
So let's get this right. You're saying that Mr. Warrington was killed in the wood grove on this property, and no one knows precisely what happened to him. But it would seem that something or someone must have attacked him, for his face to have been bludgeoned like that, said my wife.
Pretty much, I guess, said Mr. Foldforth gingerly. I know it's incredibly off-putting to hear, but I'm sure it's a once-in-a-lifetime tragic event. An accident, of course, that will never happen again. As to who or what did this to Mr. Warrington, your guess is as good as mine. As a consequence, I do know the family was traumatized by the event, as you can expect. They moved away from the property forthwith. They haven't lived in it since the incident. I imagine they were terrified of anything else untoward happening to them. Once you've had a nasty shock like that, you're never quite the same again, are you? You're bound to be fearful. I know I would be. Let me assure you, Mrs. Turnbull, that if this distressed you in any way, it is one of those outlandish things that can happen in life for reasons unknown, where invariably answers and explanations can never be found. I will say this, however, that I unequivocally believe in the saying that lightning rarely ever strikes in the same place twice. I remember when I was a child, we had a tree on our property that had been struck by lightning. My father used to always say to our family, it was the safest place on our property outdoors in a storm. Where that tree had been struck, I unequivocally believe he was right. I will cordially remind you, Mrs. Turnbull, that this fortuitous sad event happened 9 years ago. Let's just say Chuck Warrington has been letting out the premises ever since, to a family that lived here for the remainder of that time, and from what I gleaned from them, nothing untoward ever happened on the property again, to lead them to be concerned over their own safety, which is good news indeed.
I won't pretend, Mr. Foldforth, that what you've actually revealed to us is not rather disturbing, to say the very least, and incredibly off-putting, said my wife. Something or someone clearly harmed Mr. Warrington in the Woodgrove, and the question is who or what. I don't care that it happened a long time ago. I can only hope that the threat has gone, whatever that threat actually was.
As I was saying, Mrs. Turnbull, I really believe that if there was anything to concern yourself with, other people who lived in this premises would have likely experienced something unfortunate over the years, but they never did. They have only reported good things about this place. The father has been unfortunately transferred to a job in Boise in Idaho. Otherwise, they would have been quite happy to continue renting from the Warringtons. It was when the occupying family gave notice to Chuck that he decided that it was finally time to put the place on the market. He did admit to me that had he not lost his father so tragically in this way, the house would likely have remained in the family line. But I guess the place has been indelibly soiled by a rather bad experience.
All of a sudden, the other realtor, who'd been sitting in the white BMW, came sauntering into the house with an air of great professionalism that rather overshadowed Mr. Foldforth. He greeted us with a bright, warm, sunny smile, and spoke in a very posh voice that made me believe he'd been educated at an expensive private boys' school. There was definitely a pretentious plum in his mouth. He was incredibly posh in every regard, with an English twang to his American accent that made me suspect he'd lived in England at some point.
"My name is Nicholas Patcher," he said. "Tell me, how has my colleague been doing? He's new to the game, you see, and I'm showing him the ropes. So your feedback on his dealings with you will be invaluable." "He's been incredibly helpful," I said. "Glad to hear it," said Mr. Patcher, rubbing his hands gleefully. "I got the impression back there, when I was sitting in my BMW, watching you folk from a distance, that the two of you like very much what you've seen. I've been in the property game long enough to know when people are taken by a place, nothing gets past my nose. I will admit it is a delightful property, a sound investment. I wouldn't mind snapping it up myself. It's the perfect sort of house to raise a family, if you're intending to have children,"
he said, looking at us suggestively, almost as if he instinctively knew that children were very much planned on the horizon of our lives.
"This fabulous house boasts 5-bedroom and bathroom en suites. Personally, I love the emphasis on open-plan living here, where the rooms seamlessly fold into each other. I understand the architect who designed this place over 100 years ago was way ahead of his time. His name was Robert Spader. He has designed spectacular, illustrious properties in these parts, which are so classic they never go out of fashion. They are what we call, in my profession, timeless and traditional. In my book, it doesn't get better than that. You have no idea, Mr. Turnbull, how many modern places these days that were so in for their time have become rarely passé and outmoded. But this place will always be current, even in another 100 years' time, I suspect."
When Mr. Patcher had finished his little spiel, Mr. Foldforth's bashful face dropped to his knees, and then he hurriedly blurted out,
"I'm sorry, Mr. Patcher, but I told the Turnbulls here about, that unfortunate incident that happened here 9 years ago."
Mr. Patcher's face suddenly grew sombre, like a dark thundercloud. He looked quite taken aback by Mr. Foldforth's startling confession, almost as if someone had suddenly thrown ice-cold water all over his face. I got the impression that he had not expected his colleague to be so forthcoming in regard to this information concerning the house, and I witnessed him offering Mr. Foldforth a formidable glare, which I read between the lines to mean,
What the hell do you think you're doing, disclosing private information like this to potential clients? A hair's breadth away from signing a contract with us. Do you really want to lose this sale?"
Mr. Patcher cleared his throat awkwardly. He said,
"As a general practice, Mr. and Mrs. Turnbill, we don't make a habit of disclosing irrelevant information like this that is inconsequential. It happened a long time ago and has no bearing on the sale whatsoever. I'm sure you can appreciate that."
Mr. Foldforth looked embarrassed. His face grew so red that even the skin on his neck area pinkened significantly. He looked rather sheepish and bashful, like a boy who'd been reprimanded by the head teacher for insolent behaviour. As if sensing he needed to redeem the situation and soften the blow of what Mr. Foldforth had told us, Mr. Nicholas Patcher puffed up his chest like a penguin to make himself appear bigger and more important than he actually was. He let out a mock laugh and shook his head of black curls very vigorously.
"A tragic incident concerning Mr. Warrington's inexplicable passing is what happened an awfully long time ago. 9 years ago, to be exact, as Mr. Foldforth, I'm sure, has told you. That kind of thing would never happen again. It's one of life's bizarre, enigmatic curiosities that cannot be explained. And yes, it was desperately sad. You should not go upsetting our clients, Mr. Foldforth. It is not necessary to do so. They don't need to know all this about the property. As I was telling you, Mr. and Mr. Turnbill, since the incident, grievous as it was, I'm sure you agree, this house has been occupied by tenants who have rented this place for 9 long years, and there have been no other unfortunate incidents here to suggest that something so dreadful could ever happen again. Absolutely not. I mean, look around you at this place. It's a dream property, designed by an esteemed architect revered for his day. What is there not to love about the place?"
"Mr. Patre, I'm not going to lie to you, but it is a concern what Mr. Foldforth has kindly divulged to us," interjected my wife. "I am grateful he took the liberty to share this important information with us. It is significant to know these things, in my opinion. And contrary to what you may believe, I don't actually care if it happened 20, 30, or even 100 years ago. I like to know the history of a place that I'm investing in. Think about it for a moment. Mr. Warrington, who was Chuck's father, he went into that wood grove, and the next thing you know, he's hanging from a tree with his head dangling off his neck, his face almost removed from his head. That is quite terrible."
"With the greatest respect, Mrs. Turnbill, I don't agree with you on this one. For a start, as a realtor, we aren't obliged to concern ourselves with things that happened 9 years ago. No one ever does. It really shouldn't put you off buying this property. If there was a threat in that wood grove, I'm sure it's long since gone. Whatever that threat may have been, if indeed there was one. You never know what happened to Mr. Warrington. It could have been personal, could it not? Maybe he upset someone greatly. It wouldn't be the first time that had happened. And if it was personal, it will not affect you living on this premises, as that vengeful person that came after Mr. Warrington, if indeed that is what happened, is not going to come after you, are they?"
"Look, Mr. Patcher, I know you mean well, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Foldforth for kindly telling us about the unfortunate incident. So please don't come down on him hard like a ton of bricks. He did the right thing professionally telling us about this. What I will say is that me and my husband are going to have to think long and hard about whether we want to buy the property," said my wife obsequiously. Mr. Patcher looked heartily relieved. He rubbed his sweaty hand on his pinstripe suit, and his troubled eyes became significantly brighter, as if not all hope had been lost,
So you are still going to consider buying this place, are you? I assure you that you are getting it for a song. Prices like this for a highly sought-after property, superbly designed, do not come along very often. Mr. Pratcher, I'm with my wife on this one. We are both considering buying this place. We like it very much, I interjected. But we do need a little time to reflect over everything before we make any fast decisions. The story about Mr. Warrington's grisly fate has somewhat blown a spanner in the works, especially since I knew of the man. Don't be too long about it, Mr. Turnbull. I feel I should warn you, places like this have a nasty habit of being snapped up rather fast. It's only been on the market for a couple of days now, and as you're the only two people who have seen the place, as it's in quite a sequestered location, you would be a fool to pass this one by, in my humble opinion.
As we climbed into the car to drive away from the property, my wife's face was contorted with frustration. Don't you think Mr. Patcher was behaving rather shiftily? I mean, over what happened to Mr. Warrington. He gave us minimum details, don't you think? He was so obviously vague, skirted over everything. I don't care if that fortuitous event happened 20 years ago. We have a right to know about the history of the property. Did you see how worried Mr. Patcher looked when he thought that he'd lost the sale? Honestly, these estate agents can be so transparent. He looked like he wanted to bite poor Mr. Foldforth's head off because he told us the story. Poor man, I feel so sorry for him. Maybe he's too honest to be an estate agent.
So what do you actually feel about the property, love?
I asked my wife.
Do you think knowing what happened to Mr. Warrington all those years ago can put you off buying the place? I mean, whatever you may say about Mr. Pratcher, the truth is he is right. The chances of what happened to Mr. Warrington happening again are as remote as winning the lottery, I suspect.
My wife was momentarily reflective. I think if the truth be told, whoever killed Mr. Warrington did so intentionally, that's for sure. It must have been a personal vendetta of some kind. That, as you say, will probably not impact our lives at all. But given you were friends with Chuck Warrington all those years ago, it makes sense for you to look him up. Catch up with him again. Find out what really happened to his father. If you ask me, there's more to the story than actually meets the eye. If we're satisfied by what he tells us, we can put an offer in on the house at once. And I'd like to do that very much. I can't deny I love the place. It's the best place I've seen in an awfully long time. In my opinion, houses like this don't come on the market very often. So you do need to get in touch with your old friend as soon as you possibly can, before the place slips through our fingers like the last house we liked did.
All well and good, love, but I feel uncomfortable getting in touch with Chuck Warrington. It's been a long time. I wasn't always terribly nice to him when I was young. I only hung around with him and his sister, as my parents were very good friends with his parents. Otherwise, I'd probably have not given Chuck the time of day. I always thought he was filled with hot air, and as a consequence I had little time for him, and his practical jokes, of course.
Honestly, listen to yourself. What's your problem, sweetheart? Stop being so reticent and so evasive. So what if you haven't seen him for many years? And so what if you didn't treat him that great back then? You can apologise for that, can't you? You've grown up since then and seen the error of your ways. Kids can be cruel at times, but when they grow up, I'm sure they regret their bad behaviours. It'll be a perfect opportunity for you to clear the air between the both of you, will it not? To make amends. And that's a good thing, isn't it? Patsy, my wife, could be terribly pushy at the best of times. I knew she wasn't going to let this one go. She would not allow me to wimp out on seeing my old friend again. So I knew I was going to have to take the bull by the horns and pluck up the courage to get in touch with Chuck Warrington again. I will admit I was reluctant to do so. My last memory of interacting with him was telling him that nothing that ever came out of his mouth could ever be trusted. Furthermore, I had ridiculed him about his Bigfoot encounter that he claimed to have had, which I told him at the time was just complete nonsense. I wondered how he'd feel about my getting in contact with him after all these years. Would he even want to give me the time of day, given how dismissively I had treated him back then? Let's just say, had I been Chuck Warrington, I'd likely want nothing to do with the likes of me. But it turned out Chuck Warrington was a nicer man than I was, and his reception towards me was surprisingly warm. I hasten to say when he realised it was me on the phone, he was rather taken aback.
"It's been so long, bro. It's been years. How are you doing?" "I'm doing great," I said. "Glad to hear that, bro. It's a surprise, I admit, to hear from you. A good one, of course, but this is a turn-up for the books, is it not?" "It is, isn't it?" I said gingerly. "I'm wondering, Chuck, if we might get together for a drink and a light meal, perhaps, in Spokane. I understand you live there. I've something important I'd like to discuss with you." "Now you've got me intrigued. Yes, I do live in Spokane, as it happens, so meeting with you at dinner on Friday night will be great. I'm married now with my wife Cindy. We have a 3-year-old kid called Keegan. My wife always gives me Fridays off to meet up with the lads. So yes, it will be cool to see you again, and to catch up on all your news."
So there I was, sitting at a table in a diner in town that Chuck had chosen, when the man himself approached me. My face just dropped in surprise. Growing up, Chuck had always been a little on the podgy side, based on the fact that he loved his food. So I barely recognised the man as he approached me. Chuck Warrington looked like he should be on the cover of a very current, trendy man's magazine. His body was so chiselled and firm, and streamlined with muscles in all the right places. I was the one that felt conspicuously dumpy and rather self-conscious by comparison, even though I thought I was in relatively good shape, but now I wasn't quite so sure. I was certainly no Adonis or Greek god, and Chuck looked like the Michelangelo's David. I got up to greet him cautiously, but he magnanimously threw an arm around my back and slapped it. He seemed genuinely thrilled to see me, and I was touched by his warmth.
"It's good to see you, bro. It really is. It's been a long time. But the good news is you haven't changed very much." "Well, you look incredible, Chuck," I said, unable to disguise my admiration.
"Oh, you mean this?" he grinned, patting his cast-iron flashboard belly appreciatively.
"I used to be quite chubby back in the day when you knew me, did I not? Times have changed, as you can see. I'm a personal trainer these days. My job is to nip people into shape with diet and exercise regimes. So I have to set a good example to those that I preach to. Let's just say once I worked on transforming myself. I made it my life's mission to help others like me, who needed similar help in that regard. Let's just say no one understands a fat person more than a former fat person," he said, chuckling. "Back in the day, I used to eat and eat, anything and everything. But nowadays, my body is a temple." "Well, you look good," I said. "Really good. I feel somewhat intimidated." "You intimidated? I don't buy that for a second," laughed Chuck, cocking his head to one side. "Never. You always had it all together growing up. I was the one that was all over the place. My inability to concentrate during classes made the teachers as mad as hell, did it not?" Before long, the waitress came over to take our orders, and Chuck and I got caught up in a light banter, discussing the people we had known at school and where they were now. I was to discover Chuck's twin sister was running her own little mobile pooch parlour, where she made a living grooming other people's dogs. She was now happily married with a baby on the way, expected in a couple of months, and Mrs. Warrington, their mother, lived on the premises with her in her house in Spokane, while Chuck Warrington lived next door to his sister and mother with his own wife and 3-year-old child, which I thought was cool, as they'd always been a tight-knit family
And I suspect after Mr. Warrington's passing, the family stuck together all the more these days.
So tell me, what is all this about? You contacted me about something important that you wished to speak to me about,
asked Chuck, taking a sip of his beer so some of the foam stuck to his upper lip, which he very neatly wiped away with the back of his hand.
If you must know, it's about the property you're selling. I understand it was your childhood home. Me and my wife Patsy, we viewed the place a day ago. We really like it, Chuck. We're considering putting in an offer. Imagine my surprise when I discovered it belonged to you. I don't think I ever visited your house as a boy. You always came to us. It was never the other way round. Probably because it's in quite a remote location. The estate agent, Mr. Prt3of4, told us what happened to your father in the woodgrove on the property. The incident gave us cause for concern, as naturally we want to bring up a family on the premises, and we don't want to encounter any nasty surprises along the way, if you get my drift.
Chuck almost choked on his beer when he digested the fact that I was interested in buying his house and wanted to know what had happened to his father.
Oh, by the way, I must apologize,
I said, remembering to mind my manners.
I forgot to say how dreadfully sorry I am that you lost your father in such an awful way. I can't imagine what it must have been like for all of you. I'm sorry I only heard about it now. It was tough, said Chuck soberly. My mother's never been the same after the incident. It was dreadful and hard on us all. As you can imagine, based on what transpired, she could never go back to the house again. So I've been renting the place for years now. The last tenants lived there for 9 years, but they recently gave me notice. I decided to sell on behalf of my mother, to liquidate the funds. It seemed like a good idea, as renting had become quite tiresome. So what did happen to your father, Chuck? I asked inquiringly.
Chuck dropped his head sorrowfully to his beer glass, studying the foam. He avoided my gaze, almost as if he was weighing up in his mind whether he should tell me what had really happened to his father.
I'm not sure I should tell you, Jaden, he said gingerly. I don't think you would believe me. You always thought I was full of baloney growing up, and the last thing I need is to be ridiculed by you or anyone else for that matter. Look, bro, I said obsequiously, I'm really sorry how I treated you back then. It was unacceptable. I do admit I pompously and arrogantly, presumptuously thought you were full of nonsense, because you wanted to be the class clown. You loved showing off, even if it meant making up fictitious wild stories. But for the record, I do believe the story you told me about the Bigfoot you saw with your sister. I know at the time I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. But if I can redeem myself in any way, I do believe you now. You do? Asked Chuck, looking at me with a raised brow. You surprise me, Jaden. Why the sudden change of heart? You've always been rigidly stubborn, hardwired not to trust any story that challenges your belief system. So why have you softened all of a sudden? Because, if you want to know the truth, I've seen a Bigfoot myself, I blurted out. There's nothing like being faced with the truth head on to help you actually believe in it. You've seen a Bigfoot? Asked Chuck incredulously. I'd love to have seen your face when you saw it, he chuckled. It must have torn the roof off the paradigm you have of the world. Now that would have been hilarious to watch. Pity you didn't have your face on camera. That would have been comedy of the best kind. I will admit, I said, the moment I saw the Bigfoot I thought of you, Chuck, and your story, of course. I felt truly ashamed. It was like a cold slap in the face for me, and a big wake-up call, let me tell you. You could say I realized the story I thought you had fabricated to get attention, I realized was probably true, and that I had been an idiot to have doubted you. I remember at the time thinking you were serious when you told me the story. So if you were not pulling my leg, You sounded truthful. But I guess I programmed myself to doubt your integrity."
Chuck sighed.
"I assure you, bro, I did like to be the center of attention back in the day. I don't doubt that at all. I'm the first to admit that, but believe me when I say to you, I'd never use a fictitious Bigfoot story to win friends. That would be insane. I mean, who wants to be ridiculed? I know I certainly don't." "You make a good point there, Chuck. But seriously, bro, I haven't shared my story with anyone for the very same reason. So I get where you're coming from. I want to apologize for how I behaved back then. The truth is, I was the one that was full of myself, not you. But I didn't see it at the time. I was blind to my sense of haughty self-importance." "Well, you were a bit of a know-it-all back in the day, weren't you?" laughed Chuck. "You were quite snooty and sucking up to the teachers like no one else's business. You were one of those annoying pupils that always had your hand up to answer all the questions in class. You got brilliant grades, of course, didn't you? And the teachers loved the bones of you, while they loved to hate me. We were intrinsic opposites in that regard, were we not? We were thrust together due to our parents, even though we had little in common. I hated being in the classroom. I got so bored during lessons. I would do anything to alleviate that boredom of mine, like throwing wet tissue across the classroom. And I know I disrupted classes, but sometimes I couldn't help myself. I probably spent more time in the head's office writing on a piece of paper 1,000 times over and over again that I was dreadfully sorry for being a nuisance in class. Whereas when you went to the head, undoubtedly he was clapping you on the back in congratulation for another A++, I suspect." "I remember all that," I admitted. "But people rarely liked you, Chuck. You were funny, humorous. You made everybody laugh. I'll certainly give you that. You were popular, too. You were the class comedian back in the day. You had tons of friends. Everybody liked you. I, on the other hand, was boringly rigid. I was less popular, hanging around with pompous people who were as stuffy as I was. I should have let my hair down a little bit. Maybe I rebelled later on in life because, believe it or not, I married a very controversial woman that my parents couldn't stand. The first time I ever got my parents back up, I have to say." "Well, I seem to remember your parents were pretty strict, weren't they?" said Chuck. "Your father was always insisting on getting good grades. He expected the best from you. I do remember staying over at your place one night, and your father sat in on us while we all did our homework, and only when the timer went off did he let us do our own thing. I guess you were just a product of your rigidly stiff upbringing. Anyway, if you really want to know what happened to my father, I will tell you. But a big warning, it's not pretty." "I want to hear it all," I said. So there we are. That's the end of part 3. It's incredibly exciting because we're about to hear about 2 incredible Bigfoot encounters. So I hope you join me tomorrow night for the last part of our story, which you're just going to love. And we're going to find out exactly what did happen to Chuck Warrington's father. So I look forward to you joining me then. Until then, goodbye and see you tomorrow.